manager of a luxury jewelry store, humiliates Sarah Johnson, unaware that her husband, David, is watching the entire incident unfold. What happens next turns the situation on its head, leaving everyone in shock. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Sarah Johnson walked briskly through the bustling streets of downtown Miami, her heels clicking against the marble pavement. Her mind was focused on one thing: finding the perfect anniversary gift for her husband, David. Their anniversary was fast approaching, and she wanted to mark the occasion with something truly special. Something he would never forget. As the city hummed with energy, the sharp winter air nipped at her face, and she couldn't help but think about the surprise she had planned for him. She had already picked out the perfect restaurant, but the gift, that still eluded her. And then, as if by fate, her eyes were drawn to a luxury boutique that stood out among the other shops. The golden lettering on the door glimmered in the sunlight: Regal Elegance, a name that had been whispered among Miami's elite. The windows displayed stunning diamonds, emeralds, and glittering jewelry that promised wealth and luxury. Something about the store exuded a kind of magic, and she found herself walking toward the door, her heart racing with anticipation. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Immediately she was enveloped in an entirely different world. The contrast between the busy, vibrant streets outside and the serene luxury within was startling. Inside, soft classical music floated through the air, almost too gentle to notice unless you focused. The scent of roses mixed with the faint, crisp smell of polished wood and marble. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting intricate patterns of light onto the floor, while the polished glass cases gleamed with the finest jewelry. Everything in the store screamed exclusivity, but Sarah had walked in with purpose. She wasn't intimidated by the opulence that surrounded her. She was a successful professional in her own right, and her husband, David, deserved nothing but the best. As she moved deeper into the store, her eyes scanned the displays. The longer she waited, the more uneasy she felt. She moved toward a display of diamond necklaces, each one more exquisite than the last. The diamonds sparkled brilliantly under the soft lighting, and as she leaned closer, the reflection of her own face caught in the glass, making her pause. It wasn't just the jewelry that was captivating. It was the thought of how David would react when he saw it. He'd been her rock for so many years, and she wanted to show him just how much she appreciated him. She straightened up, glancing around once more, but still no one came forward. She took a deep breath and called out softly to one of the young associates walking by. "Excuse me, could you help me with this necklace?" she asked politely, her voice calm but firm. The associate glanced at her for a brief moment, then quickly turned away, her eyes scanning Sarah's wool coat, leather boots, and scarf. The woman gave a dismissive nod and said, "I'll send someone over to help you," before walking off without a second glance. Then, from across the room, Sarah spotted him. Mark Peterson, the store manager. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a sharp suit and slicked back hair, he watched her from the counter. His eyes were calculating, assessing. With a deep breath, Sarah straightened her posture and walked toward him, her resolve hardening. This was her moment. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I was hoping to look at one of the necklaces on display." Mark glanced at her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. His gaze flicked over her outfit, a subtle but unmistakable judgment in his eyes. "Of course," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "But I should warn you, these pieces are quite exclusive. Perhaps I can suggest something more suitable for someone like you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking the implication in his tone. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but she didn't allow it to show. Instead, she straightened up and replied, "I'd still like to see it." Mark glanced at her with a dismissive smile and gestured to the display. "Which one caught your eye?" It was beautiful, understated yet undeniably striking, exactly the kind of gift David would love. As Mark unlocked the case and lifted the necklace with deliberate slowness, Sarah could feel her heart racing. This wasn't just about jewelry anymore. It was about something much larger, something she wasn't going to let him take from her. Every inch of the store screamed luxury, from the velvet-lined displays to the sparkling gems in the cases. The atmosphere was so rich with opulence that it almost felt like stepping into a different world. For a moment, Sarah stood in awe of the sheer elegance around her. She felt like she was in the presence of something truly extraordinary, but the excitement quickly began to turn into unease. Sarah adjusted her coat, taking a deep breath. She was determined to find the perfect anniversary gift for her husband, David. As she moved deeper into the store, her eyes scanned the displays, glistening with diamonds and rare gems, but something didn't feel quite right. There were several sales associates gathered in the back of the store, chatting amongst themselves. Sarah waited for a moment, hoping they would notice her, but no one made any move to acknowledge her presence. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a fleeting moment, she almost turned around to leave, but no, she had come too far for that. Taking a steadying breath, Sarah approached the nearest sales associate, a young woman with her back turned, engrossed in conversation with another staff member. Sarah gently tapped the woman's shoulder. The woman turned, offering Sarah only the briefest glance before her eyes darted back to the conversation she was having. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice polite but firm. "Could you assist me with one of the necklaces?" The woman stopped talking for a moment, her gaze briefly sweeping over Sarah's wool coat and leather boots. Her face remained neutral, offering no warmth, no acknowledgement beyond the basic recognition that Sarah was there. "I'll send someone over," the associate said with a curt nod, before turning back to the conversation, dismissing Sarah completely. Her heart sank as she realized the distance between her and the luxury around her. She wasn't asking for special treatment, but the dismissal she faced felt like an insult. The store's once opulent ambiance now seemed suffocating, cold even. The bright chandeliers above no longer seemed to shine with elegance. They were now glaring reminders of how out of place she felt. Time stretched on. The minutes dragged, the oppressive silence growing heavier. Sarah's hand clenched at her side, and her frustration began to simmer just below the surface. She had seen it before, this kind of silent exclusion, the kind that made her feel invisible in places like this. She had hoped for something different, for an experience that matched the grandeur of the store, but instead, she was being treated like an afterthought. But Sarah wasn't going to let them push her around. She stood tall, refusing to let the sting of their indifference defeat her. Just as she prepared to speak up again, she noticed the manager, a tall man with slick back hair, standing by the counter. His gaze was fixed on her now, and she felt the weight of it. Was he going to ignore her too? Would he treat her the same as the others? But this was the moment she had been waiting for. The sales associates, still engaged in their hushed conversation at the back of the store, had completely ignored her, treating her like she wasn't even worth a glance. But Sarah wasn't someone to back down, especially when she knew she deserved better. With a deep breath, she straightened her coat and walked purposefully toward the counter, where Mark Davis, the store manager, stood watching her with a detached air. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and sharply dressed in a dark suit that screamed authority. His cold, calculating eyes lifted to meet hers as she approached. Mark's smile was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes. He studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her modest wool coat, her simple boots, and the scarf she had wrapped around her neck. It didn't take a genius to know what he was thinking. This woman didn't belong here. "Good evening," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm, not betraying the rising tide of frustration within her. "I was hoping to take a look at one of the necklaces on display." He seemed to be weighing her up, sizing her up in a way that was too obvious to ignore. "These are often purchased by high-net-worth clients," he continued, his words dripping with subtle arrogance. "I wouldn't want to waste your time showing you something out of your range." Sarah's breath caught for a moment. His words were sharp and dismissive, as if he had already decided that she wasn't worthy of even browsing their fine jewelry. His insinuation was clear. She was out of place. She wasn't wearing the brand names, the designer labels that marked someone as a serious customer. But Sarah wasn't going to let that stop her. She had worked hard for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let someone like Mark make her feel small. She took a deep breath, refusing to let the anger building up inside her show on her face. She had encountered this kind of subtle discrimination before, but she wasn't going to let it get to her now. "I understand," Sarah said calmly, her voice even and composed despite the storm brewing within her. "But I'd still like to see the necklace I'm interested in." There was a brief flash of surprise in Mark's eyes, followed by a slow, almost imperceptible sneer as he nodded, clearly annoyed by her persistence. "Very well," he said, gesturing toward the display case. "Which one caught your eye?" Sarah pointed to a necklace displayed under the soft golden lights. It was beautiful, elegant, yet understated. A perfect match for the man she wanted to surprise with a truly special gift. She felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. This wasn't just about a necklace anymore. It was about standing her ground. She wasn't going to let Mark or anyone else tell her what she could or couldn't have. The way he handled the jewelry made Sarah's blood run cold. He wasn't just being careful, he was treating her as though she was beneath the very thing she had come to admire. With deliberate slowness, Mark placed the necklace on the counter, but he didn't hand it to Sarah. He left it there, almost as if he were daring her to reach for it. There was something in the way he placed it, the way he kept his fingers lightly resting on the delicate chain that felt like a challenge. It was as though he was saying, "You want this? Prove you deserve it." With an air of quiet determination, Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Mark's with unyielding calm. "Could you tell me more about it?" she asked, her voice still measured, though the undertone of steel was unmistakable. Mark's smile wavered, and for the first time since their interaction began, he seemed a little unsure of himself. The condescension that had once been so apparent in his voice faltered, just for a second. But that hesitation was enough for Sarah to know she had the upper hand. Still, Mark recovered quickly, his practiced smile slipping back into place. He began his rehearsed pitch, detailing the craftsmanship, the rarity of the diamonds, and the prestige of the piece. But Sarah could hear the faintest edge to his words now, as if he realized that she wasn't like the other customers he was used to dealing with. Customers who could be easily dismissed, easily judged. The realization struck her like a slap. She had become a spectacle, an outsider in a place where she wasn't meant to be. But Sarah refused to let that show. She wasn't going to be cowed by their glances, their judgments. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. She met Mark's eyes as he finished his spiel, her voice cutting through the air with a calm but unwavering tone. "I'll think about it. Thank you for your time." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her composure intact, despite the anger and humiliation that roiled beneath the surface. But as her hand reached for the door handle, she heard Mark's voice stop her. "Ma'am," he called, his tone now sharp, almost mocking. "If I may suggest, there are more affordable options at department stores nearby. I'm sure they'd be happy to assist you." Sarah froze. Her hand hovered over the door handle, her body tense, the words slicing through her like a blade. The audacity, the cruelty in his voice was unbearable. She turned slowly, her gaze cold, unwavering. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. And with that, she stepped out of the store, into the cold night air, her heart pounding with the weight of what had just transpired. But she knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. She wouldn't let it be. Her steps grew heavier with each stride, and the sparkle of the boutique's windows seemed to fade in her mind. The gleaming jewelry, once a symbol of luxury, now felt like a distant world she didn't belong to. But the sting wasn't from the jewelry. It was from the way she'd been treated, the way she was made to feel like an outsider. She had hoped to find a special gift to surprise David, but now it felt like the experience had tainted the very idea of celebration. Suddenly her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, breaking her train of thought. She looked at the screen, seeing David's name light up. She hesitated, fingers cold against the phone, unsure whether to share the details with him just yet. Her chest tightened at the thought of recounting the encounter, but she forced herself to take a breath and answer. Taking a deep breath, Sarah answered. "Hey, babe," she said, trying to sound casual even though her heart wasn't in it. "How's everything going?" David's voice came through the phone, warm and full of concern. "Hey, Sarah, just wanted to check in. How's the shopping going? Found the perfect gift yet?" She could hear the optimism in his tone, his excitement about their anniversary plans, and it made her stomach twist. She couldn't bear to share the truth with him just yet. Just looking around. I'll find something. Don't worry about me. Everything's fine." She could almost feel David smile through the phone, and for a moment Sarah wished she could tell him everything. The way she had been treated, the subtle digs, the judgment in Mark's eyes, the sting of being seen as out of place. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. Not now. "I'll be home soon, I promise." As she hung up, she realized that she couldn't just leave it like this. The injustice of the situation lingered like a dark cloud over her. How could she walk away from that boutique without standing up for herself, without demanding to be treated with the respect she deserved? She had come there for a reason, to find something special for David, and now that goal felt tainted by the way she had been treated. Sarah scanned the room, her eyes landing on the same manager who had treated her so dismissively earlier. Mark Davis was standing behind the counter, speaking to another associate, but as soon as his eyes met hers, his expression shifted. He straightened, his confident demeanor faltering for the briefest of moments. "Back again?" he asked, his voice cool but tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Was it annoyance, or was it nervousness? Either way, it didn't matter. She wasn't here to make him feel comfortable. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice steady but with an edge that made the air in the store feel just a little thinner. "I'm not leaving until I've seen what I came for." Mark's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, his expression returning to its usual smug indifference. "Well, I suppose I could show you that necklace again," he said, almost too casually. "Actually, no," Sarah replied, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "I don't just want to look at it, I want to purchase it." For a moment, Mark didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh or dismiss her outright, but Sarah wasn't backing down. "That's what I came here for, and that's what I'm going to do," she added, her gaze unwavering. As she spoke, Sarah noticed the subtle shifts in the store's energy. The patrons who had been lingering in the background were now watching her, their eyes flicking between her and Mark, some curious, others judging, but all fully aware that something was unfolding here. Something that wasn't going according to the script they had been following. Just as Mark seemed to take a step forward, perhaps ready to continue with his usual brand of dismissive professionalism, the door opened, and in walked a tall, commanding figure, David. His presence was impossible to ignore, and immediately the dynamic in the store shifted. David wasn't just any customer. He was someone who carried authority, someone whose very presence made people stand a little straighter. He moved through the boutique with a quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah. The moment their eyes met, Sarah could feel a wave of relief wash over her. But there was something more than relief. There was a sense of power, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. David's gaze turned toward Mark, and the shift in his posture was immediate. There was no hesitation, no sign of confusion. It was clear that David wasn't someone to be trifled with. He walked up to Sarah, standing beside her, his body radiating strength and calm assurance. His eyes never left Mark, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. "Is there a problem here?" David's voice was calm, but the undertone of authority was unmistakable. Mark stammered, but the words didn't come easily. No problem," he muttered, clearly caught off guard by the sudden change in the situation. David didn't take his eyes off Mark. "Then why did my wife have to come back into this store to be treated with basic decency?" he asked, his voice low but intense. There was no anger in his tone, but there was something more powerful. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen injustice before and was ready to confront it head-on. David stepped closer to Sarah, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Together they were a force to be reckoned with, and Mark's forced smile couldn't hide his discomfort any longer. In that moment, it wasn't just a simple transaction happening in a jewelry store. It was a shift in the balance of power. Sarah and David had claimed their ground, and Mark was left to scramble for the respect that should have been freely given. The battle was over, but the war for dignity and respect was just beginning. Mark Davis, the store manager, was no longer the calm, authoritative figure he had been moments ago. Now his eyes flicked nervously between Sarah and David, the cracks in his previously unshakable demeanor starting to show. The power balance had shifted, and Mark's arrogance, once so palpable, now seemed to wither under the weight of David's unwavering stare. David didn't flinch. He had heard enough. Mark, now fully aware of who Sarah was trying to recover his composure, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The words Sarah had been holding in, the sharp sting of the discrimination she had faced, needed to be addressed, and David was the one who would make sure they were. "Mark," David began, his voice calm but his words deliberate, slicing through the thick silence that had fallen over the room. "You've treated my wife with disrespect, and I've had enough of your condescending behavior. It's time you take responsibility for it." For a moment Mark hesitated, his lips pressing into a tight line as he tried to compose himself. He knew he had lost the upper hand, but he wasn't about to back down without a fight. I don't know what you're talking about," Mark stammered, though it was clear from the unease in his voice that he knew exactly what David was talking about. "I was just trying to help her." "Help her?" David's voice rose ever so slightly, a spark of anger igniting behind his calm demeanor. "You weren't helping her. You were dismissing her. You treated her like she wasn't even worthy of stepping into this store. The moment you saw her, you judged her based on her appearance, and you treated her with nothing but condescension." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut, and for a brief moment he seemed to shrink in on himself. The smug, superior expression that had been plastered on his face since Sarah first entered the store faltered, and his eyes flickered nervously around the room. Customers, who had been quietly observing the scene, now looked at each other in stunned silence. The atmosphere in the store had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a quiet, judgmental interaction had now become something larger, something far more unsettling for Mark. David's gaze never left Mark, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "You thought you could get away with treating her like that, didn't you?" David continued, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable force. "You thought you could make her feel like she didn't belong here just because she wasn't dressed like everyone else in this store. But she does belong here. She's here because she deserves to be, and you're going to apologize for your behavior. Right now." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He was fighting to maintain some shred of dignity, but it was clear he was losing the battle. The polished veneer he had carefully constructed over the years was crumbling before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. He tried to regain some control, his voice wavering as he spoke. I didn't mean to offend her. I was just doing my job," Mark said, his tone defensive, but the cracks in his composure were becoming more and more apparent. "Your job?" David scoffed, shaking his head. "Your job is to treat every customer with respect. Your job is to make them feel welcome, not to treat them like they're beneath you. You're supposed to be representing this store, and instead you've made it clear that the only thing you care about is who you think is worthy of your time." This wasn't just about a necklace anymore. This was about standing up to the kind of behavior that had no place in the world. She wasn't going to let Mark off the hook, and neither was David. As Mark fumbled for an excuse, trying to salvage his position, the murmurs in the store grew louder. Customers who had been watching the scene unfold were beginning to take notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and a few of them exchanged glances, some nodding as they realized what was happening. The facade of civility and control Mark had so carefully built up was shattering, piece by piece, and now it was impossible to ignore. David wasn't done yet. He took a step closer to Mark, his presence imposing. "I'm not going to let this go. Not until you admit that you've wronged my wife and apologize for your actions." His voice was steady, but there was an unshakable finality in it. "You're going to face the consequences of what you've done, Mark, whether that's an apology right now or something more." David, sensing the moment of reckoning, spoke once more, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're going to apologize," he repeated, his tone unyielding. "And you're going to do it right here, right now, in front of everyone, because we're not letting this slide." The tension in the store was palpable, and even the soft classical music playing in the background seemed distant, as though the world had paused just for this moment. Mark stood there, his expression blank, his pride and dignity slipping through his fingers like sand. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, and David's firm stance never wavered. Finally, Mark's shoulders slumped, and his gaze dropped to the floor. The fight seemed to drain out of him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he understood the gravity of what had happened. His actions hadn't just insulted Sarah, they had exposed the very thing he had tried so desperately to hide: his own biases, his own assumptions about who was worthy and who wasn't. And now he had no choice but to face the consequences. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt empty, but the power of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong." David didn't move, his gaze still steady. "Louder," he said, his voice unwavering. "I want everyone in this store to hear you." Mark placed the necklace on the counter, leaving it for Sarah to take. His actions spoke louder than words, showing his disdain. The apology hung in the air, and the weight of it seemed to settle over the room. It wasn't just an apology for Sarah, it was a reckoning for Mark, and everyone in the room knew it. David's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he nodded. "That's a start," he said. "But you need to understand that apologies aren't enough. You need to do better. You need to make sure this doesn't happen again." The situation had escalated, and he was left with nothing but the bitter reality of his own actions. There was no way to undo the damage, but perhaps, in this moment, he had learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The tension in the room had eased, but the echoes of what had just transpired would linger long after they left the store. For now, though, they had taken a stand, and in that moment they knew they had done something that couldn't be undone. The fight for respect, for dignity, had only just begun. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. But Sarah? She stood tall, unshaken. She wasn't backing down now. As Mark mumbled his apologies, she slowly walked toward the counter, her eyes never leaving the display case where the necklace she had been admiring lay. It was as if a silent agreement passed between her and the jewelry. She would not let the disrespect of the store, or of Mark, dictate the end of this day. No, she had come for that necklace, and she would leave with it, with or without Mark's consent. Without a word, Sarah reached forward and picked up the necklace, her fingers brushing against the delicate chain. The diamonds sparkled under the store lights, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness that had unfolded in the last few minutes. The feeling of the necklace in her hand was a small victory. She wasn't leaving this store defeated. No matter how hard Mark tried to undermine her, this necklace was hers. "I'll take it," Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. There was no hesitation in her words, no doubt in her mind. This was her moment, her decision, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Mark's attempt to dismiss her, to imply she didn't belong in the store, had only made her more resolute. The jewelry, the status, the exclusivity of this boutique, none of it mattered as much as her dignity, and now she was taking back what had been wrongly denied. David's presence made Mark shrink under the weight of his gaze. "Are you going to process the sale?" The threat hung in the air like an electric charge, and Mark finally faltered. He couldn't hide the panic creeping into his expression. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, his fingers trembling as he reached for the register. He had misjudged Sarah completely. He thought she was someone to be dismissed, someone who would quietly walk away, head down, never to make waves. But Sarah wasn't that person, and David was right there, ready to stand beside her, to demand the respect she deserved. As Mark processed the payment, his movements were slow, deliberate, almost as though he was trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But it was clear that the power had shifted. He no longer had the luxury of being the gatekeeper of privilege. Not anymore. When the transaction was complete, Mark handed Sarah the receipt with shaky hands, but she didn't take it right away. Instead, she turned to David, her eyes locking with his for just a moment. He gave her a small nod, his support unwavering. Then, with the receipt still lying on the counter, she looked back at Mark, her gaze steely. "I don't think we're done here," Sarah said quietly, her voice a mix of calm and command. She wasn't finished with this yet. David's hand moved to his pocket, pulling out his phone. Mark's eyes widened as he saw the screen light up in David's hand. Without another word, David dialed the number for the police, his finger hovering over the dial as the tension in the room skyrocketed. He spoke into the phone, his voice firm and even. "Yes, I'd like to report an incident of discrimination at Regal Elegance. The store manager here has treated my wife in a way that is completely unacceptable, and I believe the situation warrants further attention." The realization hit Mark like a wave. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and his face drained of color. The store that had once seemed like his domain, the space where he could control the narrative, had suddenly turned on him. The phone call, the threat of police involvement, had brought him to the harsh reality of his actions. Mark began, but the words were caught in his throat. He could see the determination in David's eyes, and he knew it was too late to backtrack. This wasn't going to go away with an apology or a few empty words. The public fallout had already begun. The customers in the store, who had been watching with quiet curiosity, were now murmuring amongst themselves, and some were even pulling out their phones. The situation was already viral. The moment Mark had humiliated Sarah was being shared in real time, with every passing second adding to the weight of his mistakes. David, his voice steady, finished his call. "I'm not going to let this go, Mark," he said quietly, the threat of legal and public repercussions hanging in the air. "We won't be leaving until this is handled properly." There was no escaping the consequences anymore. The store was a spectacle now, and the repercussions of his actions, his disrespect, his prejudice, were unfolding in front of his eyes. There was no way to take back the damage he had caused. David and Sarah turned to leave, but not before Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her voice sharp. "You'll be hearing from us," she said, "and next time treat people with the respect they deserve." With that, they left the store, but Mark stayed behind, his face contorted with regret, knowing that his actions had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The real consequences, however, were just beginning to unfold, both legally and publicly, and there was no escaping what he had done. His dismissive tone, the subtle sneer that had crept into his smile when assessing her attire, and the way he had treated her like an outsider, all of it was captured in real time. People couldn't look away. It was too much, too blatant, and it hit too close to home for so many. People were enraged, appalled by the treatment Sarah had endured, and equally horrified by Mark's attempts to justify his actions. Public outrage spread across every platform, from individual social media accounts to news outlets picking up the story. What had begun as a personal confrontation had now become a flashpoint for something much larger. Discrimination in retail spaces was no longer an isolated incident. It was a conversation that needed to be had on a national scale. People shared their own experiences of being treated unfairly in stores, their voices joining in solidarity with Sarah. The initial shock of the footage sparked questions that needed answers. Why had Mark treated Sarah this way? Why was she judged based on her appearance? News anchors debated the broader implications, dissecting the culture of exclusion that had allowed this kind of behavior to persist unchecked in high-end retail spaces. Talk show hosts invited experts to weigh in, while social media influencers posted their own takes on what had happened, calling for justice and an end to systemic biases in consumer experiences. But amidst the media frenzy, Sarah and David remained resolute. They weren't looking for pity or sympathy. They were looking for change. As the story spread, the couple stood firm, using their platform not to bask in the limelight, but to speak to a larger issue. They knew that the attention this incident had garnered could be harnessed to push for real reforms, but only if they remained steadfast in their commitment to making a difference. David stood beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. "We've seen it time and time again," he added, his voice low but with conviction. "People are treated as if they don't belong simply because of their appearance. And it's time to call out these behaviors for what they are. It's time to demand accountability. Not just from the individuals who perpetuate these biases, but from the systems that enable them." Their message was clear. This wasn't a moment to capitalize on the outrage for personal gain. It was a moment to push for systemic reforms, to make sure that no one else would have to go through what Sarah had faced that day. The couple's resolve strengthened as the public pressure mounted. They spoke out not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever been the victim of discrimination in a retail setting. Sarah, once a private figure, now used her platform to bring attention to issues that had long been ignored. Her words resonated with people who had faced similar indignities, and the support they received was overwhelming. It wasn't just Black Americans who rallied behind them. People of all races, genders, and socioeconomic backgrounds were standing up and saying enough was enough. Soon, major corporations began to take notice. The outcry was impossible to ignore. Businesses were beginning to take a hard look at their internal policies, and the pressure to implement anti-discrimination training became undeniable. Social media campaigns erupted in support of the couple's efforts. People took to the streets in protest, demanding that companies enforce policies that would prevent further incidents like the one that had ignited this movement. It wasn't just about a single necklace in a luxury boutique anymore. It was about creating a cultural shift in the way customers were treated. The conversation extended beyond retail spaces. The couple made appearances at conferences, panel discussions, and advocacy events where they spoke about the need for sweeping cultural change. Their message was simple but powerful. It's not enough to train employees to be more sensitive. We need to change the very systems that allow this kind of discrimination to happen in the first place. We need laws that hold businesses accountable for the way they treat customers. We need a framework that guarantees equal treatment for everyone, no matter how they look, where they come from, or how much money they have in their pockets. Their advocacy didn't stop at the surface level either. They pushed for legislation that would require businesses to be more transparent about their hiring practices, their diversity training, and the way they monitored employee conduct when they were wronged. For Sarah and David, the experience had become a defining moment, one that was about more than just standing up for their own dignity. It was about making sure that the next person who walked into a store or any public space would be treated with the same respect and fairness that they deserved. And they knew that the fight was far from over. Even as the media attention began to fade, the couple remained committed to their cause. Their voices, now amplified by the public's support, were a constant reminder that real change was possible. They had taken something deeply personal and turned it into a movement that would inspire others to keep fighting, keep speaking up, and keep demanding equality. The road ahead was long, but with every step they knew they were making a difference. The storm had just begun. Signs with bold messages filled the streets. No more silence, no more judgment. Equality now. Stand up against discrimination. Each one echoing the same powerful call for respect and fairness. This was the start of a larger movement, one that was pushing for a cultural shift in how customers were treated and demanding accountability from the businesses that perpetuated these biases. It was in this charged atmosphere that Sarah Johnson, the woman at the center of it all, received an invitation to speak at one of the largest protests yet, scheduled to take place in Miami. The invitation had come through quickly, and it was clear that her role in the movement had grown. She wasn't just the victim of a single incident anymore. She had become a symbol of resistance, a voice for countless others who had faced the same kind of discrimination. Her story had resonated deeply, and now it was time for her to stand before a massive crowd and share her message with the world. Sarah could hear the chants growing louder, the anticipation building as the protesters waited for their chance to be heard. She felt a mix of nerves and determination. She had never imagined herself standing in front of a crowd like this, yet now it felt as though the weight of the moment was pulling her forward. This was bigger than her, bigger than the incident at Regal Elegance. This was about creating lasting change. When her name was called, Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. As she walked up to the stage, the crowd's energy swelled, their cheers a mix of encouragement and solidarity. Sarah smiled, a quiet nod to the sea of faces in front of her, each one a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The stage was simple, the only backdrop a large banner with the words "Justice for All" emblazoned across it. But Sarah didn't need anything flashy. The crowd's attention was already on her, and she knew that this moment was a turning point. Taking the microphone, Sarah paused for a moment, letting the noise of the crowd subside into a hushed silence. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces in front of her. She saw the anger, the pain, the hope, and she knew that they weren't just here for her. They were here for all those who had been dismissed, judged, and silenced. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here, for standing with me and with all those who have ever been treated as though they don't belong. I'm here today because of all of you, because of the countless people who have reached out to me, shared their stories and said, 'You're not alone.'" The crowd cheered, a wave of support that made Sarah's chest tighten with pride. She felt the strength of the moment coursing through her, fueling her words. "When I walked into Regal Elegance that day, I didn't expect to be treated like that. I didn't expect to be made to feel like I wasn't worthy of standing in the same room as the people around me, but that's exactly what happened. I was judged for how I looked, for what I was wearing, and I was told in so many words that I didn't belong." She continued, her voice steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. But I refuse to let that be my story. I refuse to let that be the story for any of us." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers deafening. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Sarah said, her voice rising in passion. "This is about every single person who has ever walked into a store, a restaurant, a workplace, and been judged based on how they look or what they wear. This is about the people who have been told they don't belong, who have been made to feel like they're invisible." The crowd began chanting her words, "Invisible, invisible," echoing back at her, their voices a wave of solidarity. Sarah's eyes shone with conviction as she pressed on. "We are not invisible. We are here, and we will not be ignored anymore. This movement, this fight, it's not just for me. It's for every person who has ever been made to feel less than. It's for the people who don't have a voice, who are silenced by prejudice and discrimination every day." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. She could feel the power of the moment, the shift that was happening right before her eyes. "But we can change that. We can demand accountability. We can create a world where no one has to walk into a store or any other space and be made to feel like they don't belong. This is not just about one store. This is about every place, every institution, and every person who has ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. It's time to stand up and say enough." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers vibrating through the ground beneath Sarah's feet. She could feel the energy in the air, the collective will to make things better, to make things right. This wasn't just about one moment, one encounter. It was about changing the way people were treated in every part of society, from retail to education to the workplace. "We have the power to change this," Sarah continued, her voice fierce now, unwavering, "and we're going to do it together. This isn't just a protest, this is a movement for equality, a movement for justice, a movement that demands change now. The crowd roared, their voices lifting the words into the air, creating a force that seemed unstoppable. As Sarah finished her speech, she stood tall, her heart full of gratitude and determination. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. And as the crowd chanted her words, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight for equality was far from over, but with every person who joined the cause, the movement grew stronger. Together, they would not be ignored. Together, they would make their voices heard. The world was changing, and they were leading the charge. The weight of their journey was never more apparent than when Sarah and David stepped into the grand, polished halls of the state capitol. They had come a long way from the day Sarah had walked into regal elegance, expecting to find a simple anniversary gift for her husband, only to leave with the sting of discrimination on her heart. The public outcry had been swift and loud, the protests had rattled the streets, and now it was time for the next phase in their fight for change: legislative reform. Sarah, despite the incredible progress they had made, felt the pressure building. Every meeting, every discussion with lawmakers, every phone call and email that came in demanding action, it was a reminder of how much was at stake. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for millions of people who had experienced the same hardships. The voices of the people continued to rise, and Sarah could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. But she wasn't alone. David was by her side, unwavering in his support, his strength a steady anchor in a storm of emotions. The halls of the Capitol felt almost surreal as they walked down the long corridors, the echo of their footsteps mirroring the pounding of Sarah's heart. Every step took them closer to the change they sought, but it also reminded them of the immense pressure they faced. In the meeting rooms, senators and representatives listened intently, nodding in agreement as Sarah and David outlined the new consumer protection laws they were pushing for. Each meeting was a battle. There were those who supported the reforms, who recognized the need for immediate action. But there were others who balked, who tried to downplay the significance of what had happened, who argued that the laws weren't necessary and that things had been blown out of proportion. But Sarah and David didn't back down. They had come too far to let the moment slip away. The stories they had gathered from others who had been subjected to similar treatment, the voices of the people who had marched in the streets demanding change. These stories were not just abstract concepts. They were the foundation of the laws they were trying to pass. In one particularly tense meeting with a group of conservative lawmakers, Sarah could feel the pushback mounting. Their skepticism was palpable. One senator, older and stern, interrupted her, his voice dripping with condescension. "What you're asking for is a solution to a problem that doesn't even exist in the way you claim. People are not treated this way in 2025. It's all just an overreaction. But Sarah, standing in front of him with the full weight of her experiences and those of countless others backing her, didn't flinch. "You may not see it, but I assure you it happens. Every day, people walk into stores, into spaces, and are made to feel inferior simply because of how they look. The problem is real, and it's time we start addressing it." Her words rang out with such force that the room fell into stunned silence. David stood beside her, his eyes locked on the faces of the lawmakers, his quiet strength pushing Sarah forward. In that moment, Sarah knew she had done more than just state her case. She had planted a seed, and it would grow. The law, the change they so desperately needed, was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a reality. As they left the meeting, David placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the struggle that had taken its toll on her. But he also saw something else: determination, fire. She had changed in ways he had never expected. The woman who had walked into regal elegance that day, Uncertain of how she would respond to the blatant disrespect, was no longer the same person. Sarah had grown into a leader, not just for herself, but for the millions of people who had suffered in silence. "I don't know how you do it," David said softly as they stepped into the quiet park near the Capitol, away from the intensity of the political battleground. "You're carrying so much, but you never back down. It's inspiring." They stopped by a bench, sitting down together, letting the silence between them be filled with reflection. "It feels like the weight of the world sometimes," Sarah admitted, her voice softer now. "I feel the eyes on me, the pressure to be the voice for so many, but every time I think about giving up, I remember all the people who have reached out to me, the ones who say, 'Thank you for speaking up.' That keeps me going. I'm not just doing this for me anymore. I'm doing it for all of them." David nodded, his hand squeezing hers. "And for all the people who will come after us. You're building something that will last. You're changing things in a way that's bigger than us." They had come so far, but Sarah knew their work was far from over. The legislation was still in the works, and the fight for systemic change wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. But as they sat there, side by side, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had started something, and they wouldn't stop until it was finished. This was their legacy. This movement, the reforms they were pushing for, the change they had already started. It was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and they knew there would be battles ahead. But they also knew that every protest, every law passed, every voice raised in solidarity brought them one step closer to the world they wanted to create. A world where no one would have to endure the kind of treatment Sarah had faced in that boutique. A world where everyone would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. As they stood up and walked together through the park hand in hand, Sarah's heart felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because she knew the work they had started would continue to grow. It was no longer just about them, it was about everyone who had ever felt unseen, and in that moment, she knew that the change they had set in motion would echo for years to come. Discrimination and unfair treatment are still far too common, especially in spaces where wealth and status are prioritized over basic human decency. Sarah's story teaches us an important lesson. Never let anyone dictate your worth based on appearances. The way she was treated in the jewelry store was a stark reminder that biases still exist in high-end establishments. But her refusal to accept humiliation changed everything. Standing up for yourself isn't just about reclaiming dignity in the moment, it's about challenging a system that allows these attitudes to persist. David's unwavering support also highlights the power of allyship. When we stand together against injustice, change becomes possible. This story is a call to action for businesses to train their employees to treat all customers with respect, and for individuals to demand the respect they deserve. True value isn't measured by material wealth, but by the integrity we uphold and the way we treat others. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and share this video with your friends. Also, check out our other videos. There are more exciting stories to come.